They all seem to know the same thing. So you're very concerned about perceived experiences, less concerned about actual experiences. That's primarily stats on stats spreadsheets and over here. Regardless of what you think about at some point, the price for ignoring reality going to catch up. So, for example, you want to check out at the cost of running check out. Well, at some point, you're going to be talking about it. Nobody's done it. Check it out. It's all backwards. So, we're talking about but you're all paying the price. Somebody will by the way, there are federal systems like so one of my favorites is basically it's us asking them so these are ridiculous. They can take weeks of I will be there Saturday. So once a week, they said, this is my safe choice. Yeah. She said, I'm sorry. I'm going to go. What else? So you didn't know he's going to get it. It's just because that makes her perception. Find out what's different there. Well, close to the
Get you there. I'll mention it. Okay, it's about time to start. Those downstairs, if you see Starling down there, have her come up. Marge is looking for her. So be on the lookout for her.
What page are we on?
Bottom of 35. And then 36 is on the other side. And then we got 37, 38 back there also. It's about time to start, so start working your way in. All right, we're on 35 and 36. I also have 37, 38 there in case I really get moving fast. So if we get everyone work their way in. Got one today. I'm not sure why. It's a doozy. What? I know. He's making fun of me. That's the sympathy pity I get.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, it's going to be this way.
Yeah, I know. The world's smallest violin.
Yeah.
I know. My kids don't even play that one for me.
Well, that's an old one.
All right. Well, lots of food and stuff back there. Appreciate Donald bringing a bunch of pizza.
Yeah.
I think most of it's just about gone, which is a good sign. Some of us are old enough, some have been coming here long enough where they remember that was a normal thing on Wednesday nights. We'd meet downstairs, we'd all bring pizza and have pizza around Bible study, and then so much so some of my kids called it pizza church. Is it pizza church tonight? So we had to, of course, stop that so my kids didn't grow up with that's a version of church. All right. Yeah, probably should.
They told me one time, I said I was a Baptist. Oh, the eating church.
Yeah, well, I would take that. And we would say it in multiple ways, hopefully feasting on the Word as well. That is our objective, not meant even in jest. Well, appreciate the concerns too for Tammy and the family with her mom's homegoing, but this past week. It's interesting how God works things out and doesn't have to allow us to know certain things, but I know not too long ago some of the kids were particularly burdened for her and sent her some emails and full of a great deal of content, and a little nervous about sending some things when you're getting pretty direct about end of life and considering it, but they sent it and weren't quite sure of the response. But Tammy got a call, I think it was yesterday, from a relative who had talked with her mom not that long ago, and apparently those emails came up and that they had been given a great deal of good consideration, and didn't have to know that, but that was a good thing to know. You're always curious about what someone is considering toward the end there, so that's good. Well, tonight, as far as notes again are concerned, we're at the very bottom of page 35, over to 36. I also have 37, 38 back there in case I just really start moving in a fast pace, which I know most of you are thinking, I don't know if I've ever seen that, but it has happened. And I was looking over the notes tonight and thought I might pick up the pace a bit, but we'll see. Go ahead and turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. There is so much content in this chapter regarding marriage, and I think it's very helpful because it deals with all things related to the idea of marriage, including a great deal of not getting married. And it does give some guidelines for those married. It gives general guidelines for those not married. And then Paul does give several benefits for not being married. And then by concession and by opinion, Paul also in this chapter tries to put forward the case for not being married. Not that being married is wrong. It's a good thing. And not being married is also a good thing. But it has several things that are involved in it. And that's where we get so much of the content here. The whole concept of marriage is greatly messed up, I think, by people because we treat it as though it's our institution. It is there for us to figure out however we want it, and it's there for me. We do benefit from it. To a degree, it's there for us, but it is God's institution. And therefore, it is supposed to be subject to His guidelines, and it is supposed to be an ideal relationship. So much so that it was used, of course, as we've already mentioned, of Christ and His church. That's supposed to be the picture of it, which is somewhat disheartening when you see how many marriages are anything but a good picture of what that looks like. So it's an ideal relationship, and yet it is also ideal, and not saying that out of a pity tone, to not be married. There are definite advantages to not being married, and the greatest of those is the greater focus that can be spent on things just dedicated to the work of the Lord. It doesn't mean then that someone who's married, that as Paul said, has to care for the things of this world or in this life, that's necessarily not for Christ. But Paul was making a solid case of how practical things aren't dominating your life, because if you're single, you just don't have much responsibility there when it comes to providing for a family, taking care of a lot of these things, especially if you're a very contented person. You don't even have to have super nice living quarters or whatever. You can just fend for yourself and be contented in it. And that's a good thing. So let's get the context again here, because this is, I think, a very essential text to cover. We don't get to cover a lot of texts that deal with the whole relationship thing. I feel every once in a while, I sometimes feel inclined that it would be nice to maybe once every 3 or 4 years to repeat aspects of the family series, just because it does seem to be something everyone is interested in, but I like to come at it from as strictly a biblical perspective as possible, because I think we miss that. We just treat marriage as, oh, I come at it however I want, and this is just how it works out. Rather than looking on it as we ought to, like one of the concepts that's listed immediately here is the husband giving himself to his wife and the wife giving herself to her husband, and that is across the board how they approach the concept of marriage. And it's not a figurative thing that's really nice and gushy when people talk about it when we're at the times of anniversaries or things. No, this is an everyday thing where it truly does describe what that relationship is like, and it should be and certainly can be a wonderful thing. A wonderful thing. But I think most of us can anticipate why it's not wonderful at times for people. And it's easy if you've come at it from an objective perspective once in a while, where I know in my situation where I've dealt with several marriage issues with couples, to see where it began. I'm always curious if we can figure out where it started, but most people are so stuck in the here and now. Here's what they've just done, here's what they're continuing to do, here's what they're always going to do, and there's already a giving up when it comes to the concept of the marriage relationship. So Paul kind of level sets this very plainly, very directly, very unashamedly about how it's supposed to be approached, and even with the physical aspects of the marriage. So verse 1, now concerning the things about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to touch a woman, and that touch is more of a sexual relationship, that's a good thing. It's also good to be married, but it's if other than marriage, it's good for a man not to. So you abstain if you're not married. That's what it comes down to. I think we stressed last week, celibacy is always practiced outside of marriage. And that's where it belongs, and that's how we're supposed to come at it. But because of immoralities, for whatever reason, each man is to have his own wife, and each woman is to have her own husband, rather than just, well, we're just going to give ourselves over to sexual relationships no matter what. No, those are immoralities. That only belongs in the marriage relationship, and that's very appropriate. It's a good thing. It's by God's design that that's where it takes place. Other than that, nowhere else. Nowhere else. We treat this with utmost respect. It's God's design, not ours. And if people say, well, I'm not wired that way, or I just have a drive that just can't be reined in, or whatever, that's all, in a sense, blaming God. Either that he's made us this way, or that his instructions, his demands are unreasonable. And both of those perspectives are wrong. We dare not go there. So, verse 4, the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise, also, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Seems like you'd have to come up with a pretty good working relationship with each other as far as the relationship is concerned, understanding this is true. If we take it at face value, which we ought to, we must take it at face value, then when it comes to the physical interface with this earth and everything associated with it, it belongs to my wife, it belongs to Tammy, and she belongs to me. And we got to kind of work these things out then, because in one sense, I belong to her. In another sense, she belongs to me, and then the relationship is built off that understanding that this is how it works. So I don't come at it and say, well, it says clearly in Scripture, you belong to me. Because then the wife could say, well, true, but you belong to me. And there is the focus of our relationship. And that shouldn't be a burden to us. This is the thing that bothers me about so many of these texts. We come at it in a defensive way or in an argumentative way, when all of these things are meant to be very positive instructions and pictures that are given. It is a wonderful thing, and I wish we could get more of this, especially in Christian circles, where people would say, I don't know if I'll marry or not, but based on what I've seen in marriage relationships, I love to be married. This would be a wonderful thing to be a part of, rather than people saying, I've just seen too much, and I would never want to have that. And a lot of people become, and they don't realize the ramifications of it when they just say, it's just the way marriages are, give it time, everybody's going to have a rough marriage, you're just not going to like each other, and you just tolerate each other, and we have no idea what contributes to that. I believe it has wave effects, even to the point where people just say, well, no, I marry, we'll just live together, we'll just have physical relationships outside of marriage and things like that, because why? Why get involved in a marriage? And I believe a great deal of that is a result of Christians not demonstrating a good example of this. So, verse 5, stop depriving one another. This is in the physical side of things, except by agreement for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer and come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Because you can't control yourself, and it's not a criticism. It's one thing to be outside a marriage relationship and to be celibate, practicing a life of abstinence, the words that are often associated with it. It's a different thing to then be with your spouse, constantly around each other, and then separating physically. This is why Paul gives some pretty clear instruction here. So the next part, he says by way of concession, but this I say by way of concession, not of command, yet I wish that all men were even as I myself am, which was single. However, each man has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that. But I say to the unmarried and to the widows that it is good for them if they remain even as I. But if they do not have self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. And who's he talking about there? The widows and the unmarried. But to the married I give instructions, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not leave her husband. But if she does leave, she must remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, and that the husband should not divorce his wife. Now, I want to make a note that's for the future here, because I've listened and read many things over the years. I even listened to a message today, part of it there, and they were dealing with that unmarried in the previous section meant women or men who had been married and now weren't married, but they're not widows because they didn't lose their spouse, so that only leaves they were divorced or their spouse left them, and then therefore they can marry. They can remarry. This is the picture here. The problem is then the same concept here is used of those, if a spouse leaves you, let them remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband in this case, and the husband should not divorce his wife. So you've got a huge contradiction here. I listened to a man I very well respect, and I was listening to him today on this text, knowing he was covering a lot of this stuff, and there were several points where he was leaving undue, and I say that as reserved as I can, but undue allowances for several instances to remarry after a divorce. And in my perspective, and I think I can solidly defend it, it was a profound example of reading something into a text that was not there at all, and trying to seem more sympathetic. I noticed this verse wasn't really stressed that hard. But no, if you leave your husband, he's talking to the woman, remain unmarried or be reconciled, and that the husband should not divorce his wife. But to the rest I say, not the Lord, so this is from Paul, it doesn't necessarily mean it's not something to follow, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he must not divorce her. And a woman who has an unbelieving husband, and he consents to live with her, she must not send her husband away. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified through her believing husband. For otherwise your children are unclean, but now they are holy. And it's a very interesting concept that Paul is sharing there, the benefit of your being in Christ in that family relationship, even though the spouse isn't. That it's worth it to stay with it. There is a sanctifying influence on the family in that case. Because no doubt they had plenty of examples of that in their church at the time. Yet if the unbelieving one leaves, let him leave. The brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. I also heard this pastor dealing with this text and saying, see, there's that word bondage, and we know that same similar word is used in Romans 7, that once the spouse dies, that you're no longer in bondage, so that must mean the same thing here. If they leave you, you're no longer in bondage to them, so now we can assume, he said, you're free to remarry. And it's not at all in the text. That is truly an assumption. You're not bound to have to stay with them, but it's not sanctioning remarriage. It doesn't say, well, I know you're married to them, so even if they want to leave you, you say, no, I'm gonna plague you the rest of your life. That's not the picture at all that's given there, or the concept that's given there. So, for how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? Only as the Lord has assigned to each one, as God has called each, in this manner let him walk. And so I direct in all the churches. I was amazed to hear this pastor present that last verse that I read about how do you know if you might save, as it were, the unbelieving. And he framed it in such a way as to say, why push it as though you're trying to stay with that marriage as you're trying to get them saved? How do you know you're going to save them? I've never taken that text that way. I've never taken it that way. I've always taken, no, you try to stay with it even though it's difficult, because how do you know? They might come to Christ anyway. Isn't that what you're after? I was just amazed, because then he was going back to the point. So there, you leave, and now you're free to remarry. And if you remarry, as we get to the end of the text here, when it deals with widows, make sure that you marry in the Lord. And it just wraps up a nice package where there's several instances there of giving several allowances for remarriage after a divorce. And that is not in the text. That is not in the text at all. And I've had to fight this one in particular for 30 years plus. It's just been a long haul, and but most people grab onto those scenarios so they can tell people, no, you're free to remarry, you're free to remarry. And here's the case. In the wrap-up today when I was listening to that sermon, he mentioned, now here's these instances, and then of course then you can remarry, and in this instance, and then you can remarry. And it was, again, a profound example of eisegesis, reading into the text. Not that the text said it or implied it, and nor was it a safe assumption. Anyway, I had to get that one off. I'll probably bring it up again. But it's because it is so popular to handle these texts these ways, even by typically very careful exegetes, people that expound on the scripture very carefully, not doing it this way. We'd ended last week at point number 2. We covered most of it there. Because of immoralities, each should be married and meet their physical obligations in this. So don't just give yourself over to immoralities and not marry. No, marry, and there's the place for the physical relationship. And again, it is a God-given, holy thing. It's a very good thing. Some of you have heard of what was called, they were the Shakers, right? The Shaker movement that got some notoriety a while back. I don't know why they got their name that way, but they basically, a group of people got together. I think there were some in Kentucky and other places like that had gotten together, and they just kind of came to the conclusion the physical relationship between a man and a woman was just evil. And of course, within a generation, they died out because who else was left? And again, that goes against God's standard. We'd ended at point C underneath that. One of the reasons, not all of the reasons, but one of the reasons for marriage was to meet these God-given inclinations, the physical inclinations, which again are good things, holy things, when used correctly. What does Satan do? He takes things that are godly and holy and wants to pervert them and use them for sinful purposes. It doesn't mean now that the thing is sinful. It just means that it's used for sinful purposes, like language. Language is a good thing. God came up with language, but language can be a very vile thing if it's used inappropriately. So it was designed to meet these God-given inclinations in a holy way, marriage being the holy, set-apart setting that makes these unions sacred. That's why it's referenced the way that it is in Hebrews 13:4, that the marriage bed is undefiled. So now where we're at today, point D, each as needed is to have their own spouse. So it's a good thing to look for. Now, we can look on this as a matter-of-fact way of just saying, well, then each have his own spouse. It's just not that easy. And I would understand that that's probably true. And most people think it just doesn't seem that easy to get a spouse. And I don't know if I want to approach getting a spouse in a haphazard or flippant way. It seems like I would want to be very careful about this because this is someone I'll be married to the rest of my life. And I would, be inclined to think I'd like this person, and we would be close friends the rest of our lives, which again, we can appeal to, that history demonstrates often that people that didn't know each other in arranged marriages still ended up having good marriages because it was the people themselves, and a lot of marriages where the young people just figure it out for themselves don't always work out well. It is astounding to me how widely accepted it is for young people not to seek the counsel of their parents or of adults in getting married. It's almost as though, no, we got this figured out. We'll know it. No, if ever, and there's plenty of times, but if ever there was a time to seek out counsel from parents especially, or older Christians especially, it's in getting married. And better to be very careful in this rather than just looking to get into a marriage. But even bad marriages, sometimes we've seen it every once in a while where people get into a marriage, they didn't marry for the right reason, it was very immature, but they work at it. My parents were an example of that, and I know there's others. But they weren't ready, they weren't good people, but they worked at it. And it ended up being an excellent marriage. But I think we can agree, better to get into it really good, really prepared, and have it great from the start, right? That seems like a pretty reasonable thing, that we don't say, well, we'll work it out as we go along. We just love each other now. Hopefully you do, but hopefully we understand what that means, and that our expectations and our preparations of what true love is, which is giving, is the primary focus in the marriage. I want to give myself to this person, and then the other person wants to give themselves to the other, and then, all right, this is a great start to a marriage relationship. Each is to fulfill, as Paul is dealing with here now in verses 2 through 4, each is to fulfill their responsibility, and primarily in this text it's physically, to each other, though this will involve other considerations such as sensitivity and emotions overall. This isn't something that ought to be approached in a careless way. It ought to be in a loving way, a gracious way. Again, this is what's wonderful about marrying a friend. Marrying a friend, and then you are truly best friends through life. Again, just a reminder there off to the left, celibacy is the exception, not the rule, typically, in our relationships. But even in marriage, where if there's a time to be apart, that is an agreed upon time, and it is not often. Top of the next page, page 36, many unnecessary, what I would phrase just bluntly, sexual tensions have been made because of various forbidding to marry rules. Forbidding to marry rules, and most often, those are in religious circles. And that's just not smart. We'll have this certain groups of people, and one of the ways they truly devote themselves to the Lord, because it's a mishandling of this text, is to just force celibacy on them, and then they give themselves over to service of the Lord. And some can, but that's not some noble trait that demonstrates, look at this person, they are more dedicated to God because they're not married. That's never the intent in these texts. There are advantages to not being married, and Paul brings them out. But there are good things to being married, as God instituted at the very beginning. Let's hope we know what those are. And it is God's institution, so it's a very good thing. But Paul is gracious in balancing out. If you don't marry, that's a good thing. And if I would counsel you, Paul keeps sneaking this in as a man now single, to say, just my concession, and I recommend, it's my opinion, he says a few times in this text, that you stay single if you can. Just remain single. And I think that's a good thing to consider. And then when the right person comes along, if you are mature and you're not overly desperate and you're just defining your life by whether or not you're married, which a lot of people allow themselves to do, especially when they're young, and they just can't imagine, I must get married, and that's just the focus, and they can't think about anything else, and that can be very risky. But if you're focused on your growth, you're in Christ, and you're given over to what He would have you do, and God then just happens to bring along however He would do it, the person that is the right person, then it would be hard to ignore, and you can, explore, I suppose, the potentials there if the person's interested in what the situation's like or whatever, but trying to be appropriate all the way through, trying to win the person over if that's the case. But many of these things have been built up in the wrong way because of forbidding to marry rules, or because total abstinence, the avoidance of marriage throughout life, is made into some virtue itself. And Paul is trying to discourage them away from that, and yet at the same time say, but it's good to also remain single. But there's nothing wrong with being married. You kind of get both sides. He's not contradicting himself. He's trying to make a case both ways. If someone is not wired, as it were, for celibate life, they will be naturally inclined to look for a mate. So they're going to be looking for someone that will marry them. But again, there's so many things that go into this, and why we seek wise counsel. We certainly want to find someone who's in the Lord, and then you certainly want to find someone who's headed the same direction as you are spiritually in the Lord. So often young ladies will see a potential guy and will be somewhat superficial on this and think, well, I think maybe he'll improve in this, and that's never a good way to start. Typically, when it comes from the perspective of the young lady, she would want to find a man that will be spiritually strong, can be a spiritual leader in the family, and then they both can go together in their walk with God and make this just a wonderfully spiritual and growing aspect of their lives. And then happen to get to live and spend their time with their best friend, and maybe if God is gracious in this particular way, gives them children, and then just a wonderful thing. But even if he doesn't give them children, to be able to have that close friendship as long as God will give it to them. Well, off to the left, well, let me deal with point F here. In marriage, each partner should be driven to meet the needs of the other. And I mean that as serious as I can. That's what drives me. I'm not driven to meet my own needs, and that's what the problem in so many relationships are now. Sadly, in a lot of counseling, my needs aren't being met. Again, you hear that in a relationship, and you're already off base. We think that's a good thing to bring into a marital counseling thing, to say, my needs aren't being met. Have you read these things? You're not supposed to be focused on satisfaction, having your needs met as you determine your needs and as you define the word met. You're here to meet the needs of your spouse. That's what your focus is supposed to be. And again, I have found, it's about as clear as it can be, not just here, but even in texts like Ephesians 5, where people will respond like, just how can you say that? There's no way that's going to work. Just great, that's all I need to hear is someone else who's not concerned about my needs. Well, I guarantee if we steer this conversation in this counseling session to your needs being met on your terms, I guarantee it won't work. It can't work. That's not what it's supposed to be. But boy, the demand is there for that. And then friends will come along, as I've mentioned already, and they'll say, yeah, that's right. It's just a terrible marriage relationship. Your needs aren't being met. Find someone that will, challenge the other person, your spouse, to be sensitive to you and to meet your needs, which I think should be done, but you shouldn't be telling it to the person who thinks their needs aren't being met. Does that sound unkind? Maybe it does to some, but it's the truth, because we're the ones who become obsessed. My needs aren't being met. That is something you can zero in on and focus so strongly on that you can't think about anything else. And a lot of these people don't even really know what their needs are, and can't even properly define what having their needs met would actually equate to, the husband or the wife. They don't know. They kind of stumble over some things once in a while, but they don't seem to know. Well, then stop wasting your time and then give yourself over to your spouse and saying, what can I do? What can I do to help you along, and to try to think that? And they might be hesitant because they're so focused on you. Wouldn't that be a wonderful argument? I say that sarcastically. But wouldn't that be a wonderful challenge to face? Where we're so busy trying to figure the other one out, we're not too apt to give up and acknowledge what we're looking for in this. I think sometimes we forget, too, that God has wired us, actually, with the ability to be satisfied in situations where most people would think are very unsatisfactory conditions. It's expectations that we fight against. Because if you give yourself over to truly loving your spouse, and they're the focus in your mind and your thoughts and in your strategies and your goals, and if you can't please them at a certain moment for whatever you've tried to do, rather than being defeated, it's a challenge. I've tried this with some husbands before who get discouraged because they say, well, my wife can't be pleased. Well, don't give up, man. You're a man, right? You're quitting? Face the challenge. Be a man. Go after it. Figure her out. Surprise her. And if they say it can't work, God graciously at least gave me an example in my parents where my dad did it. And those of you that listen to my mom's testimony there heard her say, even when he was turning around, she didn't trust him. But he proved himself that he was the real deal. And they had a fabulous marriage. So, as stressed in verse 4, this is into point F there, each is to see their bodies as belonging to the other, and that it includes our brains. Each is to see their bodies as belonging to the other. In other words, each is not to be driven to have their own, quote, needs met, but to be truly thrilled to please the other. That's not complicated. I just think people think it's not doable. Well, I'm sorry if someone doesn't think it's doable. We must do this. This is what we're told to do here, that this is our focus, to please the other. And too many people want to get married because they think, I just have so many needs to be met. And this person, I think you're the best person to fulfill it. If we could just talk honestly, I wonder how many people would think, okay, I don't think I want to marry you. If we were just beyond, I really am attracted to you because of what you can give me. And then they give all these things of what they can get from you, and that's what they want. I think most of us think, that kind of scares me here. I'm not sure I want you to come at this way. But imagine having someone come and they are thrilled in a variety of ways to be able to give of themselves to you. And I got a suspicion that even to some degree naturally, the response will be, I want to give myself to you also. I want to live for you. As I used to tell these couples struggling with these things, the fundamental need of a husband is to be respected, reverenced. And the fundamental need of a wife is to be cherished, and that cherishing love aspect there. And that typically, if the husband is focused on that with his wife, and the wife is focused on that in her husband, a man loves it when his wife is very respectful of her husband. She admires him. And it's not pretend, she really does. She thinks that is unbearably attractive to a man. He loves that. She may not, be impressed with his physical prowess. Maybe he's just not good at sports or something like that. But if she's respectful of this man in a variety of ways, and he knows that's the case, then that's irresistible to a guy. Just like a woman who has a husband, typically, that is truly cherishing of her, and he just is crazy about her and meeting her needs, wanting to constantly impress her. And as the years go on, that doesn't stop. He still wants to be impressive to his wife. I kind of wonder where that goes. If a man is more honest, and I don't think I'm unique here in just revealing something here, but I think if a man is truly honest, there is a side of him when he's young, and you see it, and it's embarrassing to think about. Do you ever see a young guy showing off? And a lot of people think, wow. Well, I don't mind that, unless, of course, the way they're trying to show off is very unimpressive to the young lady. I know, look how many leaves I can stuff into my mouth. Maybe not is the most. I'll just do that one off the top of my head. It may not be the best way to impress a young lady, but what I'm going with this is, wouldn't it be wonderful if a man never loses that? And he always wants to be impressive to his wife. He loves the idea. I think she's impressed with this. Do you ever wonder why sometimes men will come and they'll say all the stuff they're doing, and they're hoping their wives will show something that they're impressed with that? It kind of makes, what does that make a husband want to do? Show off more. He wants to be impressive to her. And it is very defeating sometimes, wives, to a man when he just is no longer impressive, and all he is a nonstop disappointment. I'm not saying that excuses him from his responsibility, but just a little hint there to keep in mind that is a fabulous way to keep a man encouraged. And I know there's some other stuff, hopefully it'll come up with the wife, but I feel like I'm a little bit more of an expert on the man side there. Off to the left, one of the greatest causes of tension in a marriage is when each or one turns their focus southward, expecting the other to fulfill their obligations. And that is understated, because that's it. Thus, the my needs aren't being met response, and then who can argue with that? That's the thing I have always dreaded in marital counseling, is just bracing myself, because that's what's going to be said, and they are entrenched there as though that is something that cannot be conquered. All I need to do is demonstrate to whoever's listening to me, and the counseling the person will think, is just tell them my needs aren't being met, and no one else can define that but me. Well, it's not as big a fortress as they think it is. That actually biblically works against them. But I have had very little success in communicating this in couples that are having marital issues. That's why I would prefer to be on the beginning side of marriages and try to level set the expectations before the couple gets married, so that this is the case before you say I do or I will, however the vows are. When approached, this is the rest of that point off to the left, when approached in this fashion, where they're looking to have their expectations met, when approached in this fashion, it makes the union forced and not the continual spontaneity of giving. That's what you want. That is, in my opinion, one aspect of romance, though that might be a risky word to use, but it is the spontaneity of giving of yourself. That is a wonderful thing. In little tiny things that might get, oh, that's nice. And in bigger ways, wow, that is just spectacular. But just making it a common thing of giving. Point G, the physical union between a husband and a wife. And I can't stress this enough. I have said this so many times in so many situations, because it's like they've gone bonkers thinking about the marriage relationship the wrong way and discerning whether or not it's a good relationship. So here it is. The physical union between a husband and a wife is to be the result, not the goal. That is so true. Enough of this nonsense out there that's allowed to be treated with any relative seriousness, that somehow we can discern the quality of a relationship based on the physical union. I guarantee if there's an issue there one way or the other, it is a result of another problem, because they've set the wrong goal. If the goal, the true goal is met, I'm giving myself to my spouse, and that is constantly the focus, and we are givers of ourselves, the physical side of things just happen. They'll just happen. Won't be anything that has to become a major issue, because you want to give of yourself, and so does the other, and that makes, again, for a very fulfilling across the board relationship, not just physically but emotionally. Emotionally, it is very fulfilling. The rest of that point there, point G, it is the natural byproduct. The physical relationship is the natural byproduct of a truly loving relationship between them, and therefore will not need to be forced in any way. It just won't be, because what is it that is causing this attraction, this coming together, this time between the husband and wife, just even in holding hands or hugging or being near each other, is this desire to give of themselves and to be near the person. Point H, neither has exclusive authority in the marriage over their own body. That should keep things balanced if we remember that. Neither one of them does. I can't lay claim to my body, and my wife, she can't claim to her body. There we go. That's how it works, because neither has exclusive authority in the marriage over their own body. which then also entails that, and this, let's hope this is an obvious point, this also entails that neither can offer it, that's their body, in any way to another outside that marriage relationship. It's not yours to give. This is another reason why adultery is so horrible. It's not your body to give up. You belong to somebody else. And if someone is unfaithful in their marriage relationship, it is a demonstration that they have missed this one big time. That they give themselves. It's not mine to give up. We are obligated to each other. No one outside the marriage has any claim at all to this. Each has their own, which communicates exclusivity to each other in mind and in body. So my thoughts are inclined to my wife, given to my wife. My body given to my wife, and vice versa. So, point I, each must fulfill the responsibility to the other. It is motivated in selflessness. That's what I, in this marriage relation for, I give of myself, give of myself, give of myself. And if you have both doing this, it is a wonderful relationship. Nobody would want to trade it. They wouldn't want to be unmarried. They wouldn't be tempted with anybody else. The only thing that they might face is the death of either one, and that then would be the only risk involved in this, extremely painful once that's lost. So, now dealing with verse 5 here, husbands and wives should not deprive one another of these times together. Now, why did Paul put this in here? This makes a lot of people uncomfortable when you get to this section. Well, it just doesn't seem appropriate to talk about. Why? It's not an unholy thing. It's dealt with very appropriately here in this text. Since there had been some misunderstanding regarding the physical union, many had come to believe then it was more spiritual to refrain altogether. So some were even thinking, well, I know I'm married, but now it looks like the in thing, at least in some circles, is just to avoid the physical relationship altogether. So I think we're going to sign up for that. And now we're going to devote the rest of our lives to a celibate relationship, even though we're married. And this is where Paul is saying, absolutely not. You're not allowed to do that. You're married. This stays as a part of this mutual agreement in this relationship. Many had come to believe it was more spiritual to refrain altogether, leading to married couples ceasing what they had come to believe was unclean or somehow not of God. Off to the left, because mankind has cheapened the sexual union, it has become associated with unholiness. But just because a holy practice is defiled by others does not make the God-ordained practice unholy based on current circumstances. So is the sexual union between a man and a woman, and now all kinds of other things out there, has it been greatly perverted? Absolutely. But does it pervert this relationship in a marriage? Absolutely not. It's actually something that God has designed, and that is the place for it. And people that have all these other relationships outside this cannot find true satisfaction in this area because they're not doing it God's way. That's a point that's often missed. That people seeking, because their drives are so out of control that they have to yield to their physical drives, don't realize that if you don't do it God's way, in God's institution, they cannot be satisfied. They'll only be flustered, disappointed. They'll only grow and increase because it's not in God's design. So if you're not married, save yourself for your spouse. And then if God has you married, then it's very appropriate. It's actually something you should do, you must do. But if you don't marry, then you don't. You don't give yourself over, you don't think about it, and you certainly don't go, well, I don't think I've got the gift, because a lot of people use these texts the wrong way. I don't think I've got the gift of celibacy. I guarantee one thing's for sure. Absolutely for sure. If you are not married, you are gifted for celibacy in that moment. Guaranteed. Because what's the alternative? The alternative comes right out of Genesis chapter 3. I'm not gifted with celibacy. I can't find someone that'll take me. Oh well, I'm just going to have to yield to my physical desires and fulfill myself any way I can, and that is sin. And that is accusational against God, as though somehow he doesn't know what he's doing, and people don't realize what they do. Because what if they do then give themselves or find a person that will take them and that does care for them, and then they do get married? What have they done with their thought life, with their heart? What has become a common way in their thinking? And not only do is bring in that dangerous, weighty baggage into the marriage relationship, and you don't want that. We just need more examples of people demonstrating in so many ways that all know this is a wonderful thing. And if you're going to get married, you are so fortunate, so blessed. It is so good if you come into it with God's perspective, in God's way. And if you're not married, don't worry, we're going to get to that. A couple more points here. Point B, the only exception in this instance of not coming together given is for an agreed time by both. The underlying word for agreement, love some of these Greek words that you think, wait a minute, I think I get the picture here. It's symphonu. If you do the verb, I think it's symphoneo. It's where we get our word symphony. You've got to be in harmony, in other words. They need to be in harmony with each other. This time is phrased as a time literally to devote yourselves to the prayer, which may have been in reference to a designated time in practice of the church, like a time of fasting and prayer. It looks to be some formalized time that Paul was pointing to, that it might be a good time where you agree that you will not come together. But even then, he's not saying it would be wrong to come together. It's just a time where both the husband and the wife think, okay, for whatever spiritual reason, we're going to abstain, but it's only for a short while. And Paul tells why. You don't want to be given over to particular temptations that Satan seems to have some involvement there, as his name comes up in this text. Point C, the emphasis, though, is not on the religious separation in this verse here. It's not on the religious separation, but on the coming together again. That's the emphasis of the text. Okay, there might be times when you do agree not to come together, and some people have fixated on that. Well, here we go. That's just what we're going to fixate on. And it's amazing how many people can't help themselves when they have spiritual, dedicated times like that to tell everybody else that we have a special, dedicated time. I think we treat this like we do fasting and prayer. Remember what the Lord talked about fasting and prayer? When you fast, go tell everybody, make sure people see that you're fasting. No, don't let anybody know. Clean yourself up, try to look normal. Don't go telling everybody that you're doing this. You're in deep prayer and a time of fasting. If it's the real deal, it'll just be between the husband and the wife, and they're not going to go telling everybody, here's what great spiritual achievements we've accomplished. People don't care anyway. It's amazing how oftentimes people will bring these things up. The emphasis, though, is not on religious separation, but on the coming together again to aid in fighting off Satan and the temptations likely to grow because of your inability to control yourselves. And what's interesting about this, again, not a point of criticism, but because you're not supposed to in marriage. That's the interesting point in this. You're not supposed to in marriage. And yet so many times people do, and there's various reasons for this. Sometimes people get to this point for other things and their ideas, and I'm stepping into dangerous territory, I'm sure, but because of birth control pursuits and things like that, and I believe that then can be traced back to then why? Why is that the case? And is that a godly pursuit as well? And then it goes to then the view of children, which is not dealt with here, so I won't deal with it here. This was not a criticism when he said your inability to control yourself. It was not a criticism in this context, as some might take it, but was a recognition of the natural course of things. This is needed for those not graced, particularly with celibacy, and I guarantee if you're married, you're not graced with celibacy. You're not supposed to be celibate. That's a pretty easy one. So no, don't do this. Don't separate for seemingly religious purposes for very long. You might agree upon it, but not for very long. Apparently that was a big deal that had to be dealt with there in Corinth at this time. So point D, the emphasis also should not be, for instance, a husband threatening his wife that he will be weaker, but is more that the wife recognizes this as well as the husband, each for the other. That's not the point where, well, if we do this, I'm just not going to be able to take it. And that this is what comes up, but that she would be the one thinking about that. And then the husband needs to trust his wife. And that the husband will be the one determining this for his wife, and that she would have to trust him. It's interesting when you keep coming down to this, how much trust is involved in the marriage relationship. You're trusting one another with the closest relationship there is this side of eternity. There is no relationship you and I will ever have that is closer than a husband and wife. And it's one full of trust. It's no wonder why people appropriately, understandably, are scared before they enter into this. That's why you want to make sure you really do, as best you can, trust this person. To give yourself over to them and they to you. And you want that trust to be there, and you don't want it to be messed with. You don't want to take advantage of that or infringe upon it, because it's God's institution. Off to the left, one of the benefits of marriage is that each looks out for the other, and in so doing strives to strengthen and build each other up in their individual as well as their combined walk of life in faith. That this is just ideal how it works. I get these sense every once in a while that there's a lot of my needs sometimes aren't being met, when someone's not nice to you at work, or you're just not feeling well, and there's all of these other things. And then you can think, yeah, but my wife loves me. She cares for me. Everybody at work, I'm exaggerating now, everybody at work hates me. They despise me. People look at me on the street and they hate me. They think I'm stupid. They don't want anything to do with me. But my wife loves me. And that she would be able to think the same thing, that this is wonderful in this, and that there is someone out for me in this relationship here. It's a excellent safety net emotionally to have if both are focused on it. Imagine if you can go through life and that's the constant focus. We've got each other's backs. We're out to protect one another. That's why the virtuous woman there in Proverbs 31, her husband's heart safely trusts in her. And one of the things, again, that I find interesting is that he's not nervous about that. He is spoken well of even in the gates. Because of her. She lends to that. Who thinks of that? Most of the time, husbands just realize, I just know what's going to happen. She's going to go just badmouth me, and everyone's going to know everything bad about me. In a way that it goes, what a contrast there with a virtuous woman in Proverbs 31. Husband trusts in her, and he's got a good reputation. And his wife lends to that. That's a very good thing. Point 4, I just want to introduce this. Each is to live in light of their God-given condition. There in verses 6 and 7, I say this by way of concession, not by command, yet I wish all men were even as I myself am. However, each man has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that. So live in light of your God-given condition. And again, you may not be sure of it. You may think, well, I'm not a celibate. But as I mentioned, you are if you're not married. Don't lose sight of that. And don't try to leverage that against God. And if you're not truly gifted in that area, God will bring along a spouse. There's a whole other category we could get into. It's not dealt with here. But then what ought you to be looking for in a spouse? I think people got it all messed up. They're so focused on the externals that you're not actually looking for so many of the good things in somebody else. I'm not saying that the externals don't play some part in it. Attraction, physical attraction, is not anti-God. He's the one that gives us this view of what is attractive versus what is not. But there's so much more to attraction. And if we would just grow a little bit, it's amazing the other things that might be even more attractive to us as we are growing ourselves. And then you start to understand, then as we get older and the physical isn't so appealing anymore, and yet the couple are still crazy about each other. Probably confuses a lot of the superficial young people. I don't see what they see in each other. Ooh. They don't have a clue what love is. They really don't. I used to think, I think that's what old people say. But no, it's true. What you can love that person because you love them. You love the person. And I don't know how else to say it. And then it's everything about them. Even though we just don't get better looking and more physically fit as we get older. That's okay. Who better to grow old with and to start to decay? It's probably not the best way of saying it, but there we go. Then with your best friend. Then it's kind of funny. It's kind of nice. Because even as I slowly fall apart and am not the physical, wonderful specimen of a man I used to be, Tammy still loves me, probably more so than ever. I don't think I'm presuming upon that. She seems to indicate it that well. And I still feel pretty good about myself, even when nobody else is impressed. That's okay. It's a wonderful thing, and I'm not exaggerating about these things. This is exactly how it's supposed to be. And it's a wonderful thing, rather than people looking, how can people that get older and not in as good a shape and we start to just fall apart and everyone, how can you truly love somebody? I don't know if we can fully explain it, but I love the person. I really love the person. And that's that attraction that won't stop. Well, that's love. That's a marriage relationship. So that the old couple that you see together, they're not just pretending to impress the kids that, some miracle happened. No, they actually do like being with each other. They like holding hands. They like being near each other. They enjoy each other's company, which most people think, that's a wonderful thing. It just doesn't happen anymore. Why not? Why not? Because we believe a lie. We don't see the priorities that are given here. So let me just read point A underneath it so I can feel like I made some progress. Individual and societal standards have their place and are often challenging, and some are protective. But often someone's personal standard becomes popular and showcased before the masses. And there can be two different kinds of standards, generally speaking, the married and the unmarried. And it's put forward as what should be a norm for everybody. Because sometimes you get people, and I'm trying not to do this, even though it sure sounds like I am. Everybody should be married. Everybody should be married. Something's wrong with you if you're not married. Everybody should be married. Should I say that? No, I shouldn't. And someone says, I'm going to side with Paul there, because it sure looks like my lot in life is to be single. Everybody should be single. Look at all the benefits of being single. Should I say that? Well, maybe the benefits, but not everybody should be single. I shouldn't say that. So we've got to be careful about how we come at it from our own personal perspective or someone's particular example. But I do know if I'm going to be married, I want to be a shining example of that, and we do want to be able to point to certain examples and say, no, there are some really good marriages. That's what you want. These people love to be around each other. And one of the best tells of this is our kids. Because our kids know. Our kids know if we like being around each other. Because again, I've gone back to that example several times when I was that youth pastor at the church in East Lansing. And every single one of the guys that I counseled came back and said, my parents don't like each other. They don't like each other at all. They're not crazy about each other. They don't love each other. They just put on a show for everybody. 100% of the guys, at least, because I wouldn't counsel with the girls anyway, alone. But they were all same thing. And there were several guys. And They knew it. So, the people, I think, when we're dealing with a marriage relationship here, that we want to demonstrate that it's the real deal is, first of all, to each other. That my wife knows it, the husband knows it, is a real deal. I really do care for you. I am really yours. And then that the children see it. The children see it. And I can't stress this enough. Husbands and wives, do not ever take sides against each other with the children. That's a huge error. That is defiant of texts like this, as well as Ephesians 5, that we would side with our children against one another. Yeah, your mom, she's really got some issues, or I'm with you on this. She's got problems here. And then we take sides. That is a horrible thing to do to your spouse. And it doesn't help your kids. I talked about, okay, I'm going to put the little marker up here because I'm going to start at A. But I still remember, and I was confused at first, one evening, I have no idea why, it was a summer evening, I don't remember why I remember that, but my parents called us upstairs to the room, kind of one at a time, and we walked in there and they're kind of just sitting in bed. For some reason, that was a common place for us all to come around. They had a king-size bed, and we would sit in there and talk sometimes. And I remember it was my turn. I came in and thought, are we in trouble? We weren't, fortunately. So it's a pleasant memory. But I remember my dad looking at me and said, Don, if you could have it any way you wanted, would you want Mom and I to love you more or to love each other more? We're just curious. I said, well, that's an easy one. Each other. And apparently I answered correct, because all of us answered the correct way, because that was true. And I thought, why did he ask that? I never thought about it till later. Wait a minute, that's a pretty interesting question. I suppose some would think that the answer is, well, I want you to love me more. But no, you got to thinking about it. What if they didn't love each other? And you think about that for a moment. I had my parents, at least by the time I started to really be aware of things, I had a pretty good relationship, and I thought that would be terrifying. If Mom and Dad didn't get along, that would be scary. I can't imagine being more scared than that. I guess I'd rather be mad at me than mad at each other. Just to give it some thought. And I think sometimes husbands and wives forget about that, at least in their relationship with their children, because we really want to set the standard there for our children so that they'll think, if I do get married, I want what they have. I want to have that where they truly have demonstrated what it ought to be. That doesn't mean that children coming out of a situation where the marriage of their parents was poor will just have a horrible marriage, because sometimes they'll come out of it with enough insight to say, I know what I don't want. But that's a sad scenario. And again, I appreciate that my parents had a horrible start, and then demonstrated that, oh no, I can be turned totally around and be crazy about each other. So even if it's in bad shape, it doesn't mean it can't change. There's a scriptural motivation for that, and then other examples. So we'll pick up with point number 4 actually next week on page 36, and then move on to more of these detailed instructions as we go along with the whole concept of marriage and being unmarried, and all the various scenarios that come with it. Let's pray. Father, thank you for these particulars, especially understanding that there were many challenges back then that they were facing. It's no doubt we face today. I would ask that each of us would be driven to be shining examples of this if we're married or if we're single. That we would want to first showcase your rightness beyond all things, and then to be able to prove, because we're obedient, that your will is good, acceptable, and perfect, because we've given ourselves as a living sacrifice to you. Please, Father, let this be our drive. Let us realize in faith that this is where full contentment is to be found, in trusting you, in obeying you. This we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Yep. But hopefully it's not too big a challenge if they step into it for the right way.
But that's the way I tell them. You're lucky enough to get married, and then learn.
But now you will learn it. Yep.
This way, you understand what they are,
Yep.
and then you get to know them.
Absolutely. Rather than getting into it and saying, well, I want to be loved more. No, you want to love more. That's the difference.
Did you ever send a file to us? You never printed out?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's for the taking that side out.
Oh, okay. Yep.
It's recording, so I assume it's video.
Coming.
Underestimated college outputs for training. I want it just to keep me safe for now. I'm gonna get paid Wednesday, so I'll be good next Wednesday.
Actually, I almost through leaves illustration.
My what? Leaves?
How many leaves can stop it?
You say 50?
Yes, Emma says that's what what a big, I couldn't get it
I'm
up
thinking
there.
something absurd.
You start thinking more seriously, it's just like,
Forty roses of red poetry, huh? Yeah, so 200, she's like 200. 200 messages? That's just in case if I accidentally ask them to do it, where it like just shoots up in messages. Because I'm nervous one of these days I'm gonna like go to that. But I should be happy. So I should make it. Yeah, but I think my estimate is 6 months. You guys I work extra days and I also work with you.
I heard, and he was going out the house. Two kids. They only had three. Someone took it. Yes, of course he gets it. Oh.
Someone would stand there laughing, and it would be something, you know, it's weird. I think it was
Yes, you were born that way. That's right. You were born again.
Whoa, perfect. That's perfect. That is exactly right. We were all born the same. We were the same. Some of us grew out of it.
Yeah, he
Get my, let me just test. Every once in a while I can do something wirelessly. Most of the time I can't.
Have this every day.
Wow, nice. It's still something cold and wet.
Lead summer camp.
You know, they eat.
Everything's revolves red. Lead paint, lead cups.
Which one do I print? There's two.
One's an example form, one's the actual form. So maybe both. Yeah. That's the Marine Corps. It's the federal government. What'd you expect? But that's good enough for them, so, you know. Good enough for me. Good enough for government work, as the saying goes.
Let's see if it works. French fry man versus a real rat.